Hello and welcome to World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing. On today's program, U.S. President Donald Trump debuts at the UN General Assembly, trumpeting his America First agenda. Can his words before the world body help ease the jitters in the Korean Peninsula and many other troubled hotspots? Myanmar leader Aung San Suu Kyi breaks her silence over the plight of Rohingyas. Would a worried international community listen to her account of what the UN called a genocide? And we start in New York City. At this point, the U.S. President Donald Trump is making his maiden speech at the UN General Assembly. Listen to him just very briefly earlier. He's been talking about the basis of mutual respect between and among countries and also America First principle. The leaders are gathering there for the 72nd United Nations General Assembly. U.S. President Donald Trump is delivering his first speech before the world body. He's also likely to tackle some of the other issues ranging from nuclear and missile testing by the DPRK to ongoing civil wars in Syria and Yemen. We'll see whether the issue of Iran is also likely to be touched on by him during his first speech to the UN General Assembly in New York. Joining me to talk about the key points of his maiden speech over there, we have in our Beijing studio Teng Jianqun, Director of the American Studies Department at the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome to our program. Also in Beijing, Rick Dunham, who's co-director of a global business journalism program at Tsinghua University, certainly a very seasoned Washington journalist, used to be there for decades in Washington. And in Boston, we have Jim Walsh, Security Studies Program with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Of course, the speech is still going on, and yet there are already some points jumping out for us to take a closer look and put some analysis here. He talked about America First, the U.S. President Donald Trump. Of course, he has been criticized heavily about this slogan, yet at the UN General Assembly, he did win some applause. How should we understand this, Mr. Walsh?
Well, when you come to a Donald Trump speech, the first question you have to ask yourself is, which Donald Trump are you getting? Are you going to get one who stays on script and tries to appear presidential? Or are you going to get a guy that's going to freelance and complain about perceived slights and sort of rant? Well, we've got some answer now. For the first several minutes of this speech, he has been the presidential Donald Trump, which we don't see very often. He's sticking to his speech. He's reading off the teleprompter. I think so far, so good. He hasn't said anything that would be particularly controversial or that others in the room might find insulting. So I would say that's the sort of Donald Trump we have right now, which is a surprise. At this
point, he is talking about DPRK. Let's listen in. North Korea.
His brother using banned nerve agents in an international airport. We know it kidnapped a sweet 13-year-old Japanese girl from a beach in her own country to enslave her as a language tutor for North Korea's spies. If this is not twisted enough, now North Korea's reckless pursuit of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles threatens the entire world with unthinkable loss of human life. It is an outrage that some nations would not only trade with such a regime, but would arm, supply, and financially support a country that imperils the world with nuclear conflict. No nation on earth has an interest in seeing this band of criminals arm itself with nuclear weapons and missiles. The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime. The United States is ready, willing, and able, but hopefully this will not be necessary. That's what the United Nations is all about. That's what the United Nations is for. Let's see how they do. It is time for North Korea to realize that the denuclearization is its only acceptable future. The United Nations Security Council recently held 2 unanimous 15-0 votes adopting hard-hitting resolutions against North Korea, and I want to thank China and Russia for joining the vote to impose sanctions, along with all of the other members of the Security Council. Thank you to all involved. But we must do much more. It is time for all nations to work together to isolate the Kim regime until it ceases its hostile behavior. We face this decision not only in North Korea. It is far past time for the nations of the world to confront another reckless regime, one that speaks openly of mass murder, vowing death to America, destruction to Israel, and ruin for many leaders and nations in this room. The Iranian government masks a corrupt dictatorship behind the false guise of a democracy. It has turned a wealthy country.
All right. Earlier, there have been remarks coming from the U.S. President Donald Trump during his first speech at the UN General Assembly taking place right now in New York. He's been talking about the U.S. stance on the DPRK. He has been talking about the UN Security Council resolution. He thanked China and Russia to join hands during that resolution. And he also talked about that's the legitimacy of the United Nations, which is to seek solutions to some of the thorny issues of the world. Having said that, though, he has also been talking about so-called destroying North Korea. He said the U.S. is ready, willing, and able to do that, and yet he said, we hope, quote, that is not necessary, and he's calling on the international communities to so-called, quote, isolate North Korea, while at the same time to seek a solution. He did not mention very specifically what the solution is. He did not mention about the U.S. obligation of approaching North Korea not only with sticks but also with carrots to seek solution for dialogue and conversations. Let's come back to our panelists. The three of you been with me, listening very attentively. Everything he said. There seems to be several layers that he's trying to lay out. Mr. Tung, as someone who's doing research for decades on the nuclear issue and a key expert from the Chinese side, what do you make of President Trump's speech, particularly regarding the DPRK and relations with China?
Actually, he repeated the U.S. position toward DPRK, especially in recent 7 months after he took the office as the President of the United States. Donald Trump actually so far has not yet got the clear-cut in the policy toward DPRK. This is only a repetition for the old policy toward including the cooperation among the major powers, among China, Russia, and the United States, and also some other choices still on the table.
I see.
And actually is a continuation of not so clear policy toward DPRK at this moment.
And he said specifically totally be able to destroy North Korea if the other side, from his perspective, is provoking further. How do you see that? Because China is in the neighborhood of North Korea, certainly.
Yeah, I don't think this is the first time for the president to say such a thing, to the outside world. And, since February, when the tension initiated by the launch of missile and also the military drills by United States and ROK. The tension had been there, for at least 7 months. I think Donald Trump even said everything is okay, especially in the use of force against DPRK. And this time, actually, he just repeated the old policy toward DPRK. No new.
Do you agree, Mr. Dunham, that he repeated actually the previous stance?
I have a slightly different view.
All right.
I think that what he's not talking at all about is talks. This is his part of the speech when he's talking about North Korea.
There's no mention of that word at all.
That's right. No discussion, no peace talk, no anything. It's get rid of your nukes or we will destroy you. Now, you can't have a nuclear bomb that only affects North Korea. I mean, nuclear weapons could cross the line into South Korea, into China, into Russia. I think it's a calculated move on his part to sound so bellicose. I mean, it sounds like he went to the Kim Jong-un School of Diplomacy with his speech. So he's going one insult after another.
So who is he speaking about this to? Is he speaking to the so-called rocket man, which he always preferred to call Mr. Kim, or is he speaking to the international community? Remember, all the foreign ministers, presidents, prime ministers are sitting there, including foreign ministers from Russia and also from China. And also, we have head of states from many other countries over there, including the foreign minister of North Korea as well at the UN General Assembly. So who is he speaking to?
I think he has 4 audiences. One is the American people, probably the least important audience that he's speaking to. Or second, Kim Jong-un, he's talking to the North Korean leadership. Third, he's talking to the international community at large, saying this is the direction I'm going, whether you're with me or not. Fourth, China and Russia. He is saying no trade with North Korea. It's time for extreme action to make a change.
Okay, one word that he used, isolate. What Mr. Walsh, you probably could help us understand what exactly is this isolate mean? Does it mean not to deal with North Korea? But you know, how could you have peace when you do not deal with the other side of the controversy? And secondly, did he propose anything? Did he propose anything in the just delivered paragraphs related to DPRK?
No, I don't think he proposed anything. I did take notice of the fact that he went out of his way to thank China and Russia for the latest UN Security Council resolution. As for isolation, I think that's just traditional U.S. foreign policy tool here. By isolation, they mean diplomatic isolation, which you see this week. For example, Spain kicked out a ambassador from the DPRK, and then economic isolation. And you know, there have been those at in the American delegation at the UN who tried and failed to get an economic embargo against North Korea, which in traditional legal terms is, in the old days, used to be considered an act of war. You know, when we first spoke before we went to the UN, to his actual remarks, I was just saying what a surprise it was that he was reading a script and seemed presidential, or at least in relative terms. And then we go to this, his remarks, and he immediately starts to call him Rocket Man, and then, you know, it's very unusual for a president of the United States to get up before the United Nations and then threaten to destroy a country. Normally, speeches are not like that at the UN. So I guess he started off pretty restrained, but the more he goes on, the weirder, and I would say the more sort of direct and insulting he's become.
I see. UN General Assembly. A speech like this is usually being delivered by every head of state, 194 countries, and also represented from the so-called regions and places, all represented, all have their own 15 minutes. Of course, but this time, Mr. Trump tends to go a little bit longer than that. That is the time when everybody can say what's on their mind or what they want others to see what's on their mind. And nobody gonna prevent them from saying anything. Okay, that is the rhetoric. What about the real action, Mr. Tong? Right before the General Assembly speech given by President Trump, he spoke with Chinese President Xi Jinping on the phone. This is one of the many times that these two gentlemen spoke to one another. And they talk about their domestic issues, that they have both domestic big issues going on, but at the same time, touch on the DPRK issue. Of course, both sides did not elaborate as to exactly what is the content regarding to the DPRK they were talking about on the phone. But Mr. Tong, given your knowledge, how should we relate all of these things together?
Yeah, I think
what kind of map can we figure out now?
Yeah, I think the phone call has already become a routine job for the two presidents when they are going to talk about, relative issues like the DPRK and Paris Climate Accord and some other issues. They just picked up their phone and they had such a call. This is a very important routine arrangement for the two leaders to have a consensus in dealing with the challenge. For example, this time they touch upon the DPRK nuclear issue, and this is a real and direct threat for both countries, for China and for the United States. We should, face the reality this is the reality. The direct and real threat from DPRK is the missile capability and the nuclear. And I think this time, even Donald Trump appreciated the position from China and from Russia, but I don't think he can afford the price to have a real war against the DPRK at this moment.
But Mr. Walsh, we did notice from Mr. Trump earlier, talking about the UN Security Council, we see that President Trump, from time to time, needs to have the support of the legitimacy of the UN Security Council, for example, on the issue of DPRK. And yet, on the other times, he seems to switch that position, suggesting the UN is not anymore that useful. Even though yesterday he was at the UN meeting talking about the UN reform, very much agreeing in line with the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Guterres, about that reform. But we see skepticism very strong from him. So how should we understand this quite divided position about himself, in a way, as the President of the United States? On the one hand, he does need legitimacy of the UN. On the other hand, he does not seem to like the UN, and he does not seem to be very interested in it. Briefly.
Yeah, well, I think that pretty much captures it. And this is not the first instance in which the president has held views that are in tension with one another. And sometimes he goes off and even offers views that are contradictory. So I think this is, it's ironic phrasing, but it's certainly consistent. Mr. Trump's inconsistency is fairly consistent. Now, in this case, I think he can wrap, in his mind, and here I must only speculate, but I'm guessing he's saying to himself something like this. He's combining the fact that he feels that other countries aren't carrying enough of the burden, the so-called burden-sharing problem, and that other countries need to spend more and do more, and he's sort of pivoting with that theme into the UN by saying, well, the UN should do more than it's doing, including reforming itself, but it should contribute more to helping the U.S. solve international problems. And so he gets to have a little bit of both at the same time.
Right. Of course, when we talk about President Trump, we always wanted to refer to his tweet, which is very personal. He did mock at the UN as being weak and incompetent and bad for the U.S. It is still there in his Twitter history. In December, he tweeted, the United Nations has such great potential, but right now it is just a club for people to get together, talk, and have a great time. So bad. Of course, he is there today and talked. And we are going to wonder what kind of tweet he's going to send later after this. But coming back to you, Mr. Dunham, that really shows what is likely to be this very entangled relation between the United States and the UN in the future. Not only U.S. and the UN, but also U.S. and the other international organizations, the international mechanism as well. Will he change after this? When he get the support of the United Nations Security Council on some of the most crucial issues that he considers, will he change?
Donald Trump is not changing. The one thing you saw today...
Well, you could be so firm about that.
Because he's saying the same things that he said during the campaign, but he's saying it more diplomatically. He was as undiplomatic as could be when it comes to North Korea and Iran, but when it came to his criticism of the UN, it wasn't at all like on the campaign trail when he was mocking and insulting, and in his tweets when he just criticizes the UN.
But people could just say, well, you know, Mr. Dunham, you're from the American media. It is no secret the media doesn't like your president, right?
Well,
it's on the
doesn't get very good coverage, that's
every
for
day.
sure.
And Mr. Walsh, of course, I mean, you are one of those American elites. Mr. Trump is now catering at you when he's delivering his speech. He's looking at those in the Midwest and someone so-called redneck. So no wonder that the two of you did not like your president. But he might get a lot of support back at home, Mr. Walsh.
Well, I would say that I would point out, you probably don't know this, that I came from very modest means. I was the first person in my family to go to college.
All right.
And so I am not given to elite by birth like a certain president I know. But, you know, I do think it's true that most foreign policy professionals have been skeptical about his competence and skeptical about his policymaking. I think that that's right.
We've been having some challenges. Try to incorporate some of the panelists into our discussion today from the United States. We understand the challenge that you are talking about, Mr. Walsh. Having said that, though, on a very serious note, Iran is also being touched by President Trump. And of course, there were a lot of harsh words against Iran. And French president was warning about this, saying if the Iran deal could not continue, the effect of it is going to be horrendous. Something like that, earlier, right before the Security Council speech. So what kind of role, Mr. Tang, as a nuclear expert, should the U.S. play and China stands?
I think the U.S. under the leadership of Donald Trump will change a little bit toward Iran at this moment. This is not a nuclear deal. This is actually a geopolitical competition. After the war in Iraq and after the destruction of Taliban in Afghanistan, actually Iran has already become the major power, the major region power in the Middle East. And the United States actually has been worrying about the future of the balanced power in the Middle East that might be changed by the rising of Iran. So this is not a nuclear issue. Actually, the nuclear deal, I think, has been a good deal among all the parties concerned. So
but
the United States...
But if that deal is not continuing, Mr. Walsh, as a scholar in nuclear issue, you understand that there's going to be ripple effects, and that's going to have a big impact on the DPRK issue as well. Any chance of peaceful solutions?
Well, certainly if the Iran deal goes away, it would make negotiating any sort of agreement with North Korea very difficult, because the North Koreans will rightly say, why should we sign an agreement if the U.S. is going to tear it up 2 years later? So I do think it has a direct impact on the Korean situation, or the prospects of solving that peacefully. And I think, decertification, if it happens, is going to happen mid-October, around October 15th. Clearly, the president wants to do it. He's being told by his entire cabinet and national security team not to break the deal, and yet he keeps talking out loud, as he was in the speech, which I heard a little bit of, saying the same thing and promising that he's going to overturn it. I think it's very destructive. Clearly, the French and the Europeans are telling him not to do it, along with all his staff and all his cabinet members. But the president often ignores that. He did it on the Paris Peace Accord, where he was told by all his cabinet to stay in. He got out, and we'll face that deadline in mid-October. So I think it's a very nervous time, if you ask me.
It is a nervous time, but it's also an exciting time, You always have very contradictory things going on all at the same time. As we are speaking, President Trump of the United States is still delivering his speech at the UN General Assembly. Usually every head of state have 15 minutes or so to deliver a speech, but earlier we've also seen President Obama giving 38-minute long speech, and Fidel Castro, for example, giving a few 100-minute speech. And so President Trump is still going on as we are speaking. Certainly, CGTN, together with World Insight with Tian, we will bring you all the latest while our show is going. You are watching World Insight with Tian, still to come on our program. Myanmar leader Aung San Suu Kyi addresses the Rohingya refugee crisis, saying her country does not fear international scrutiny. We'll discuss the plight and flight of the Rohingya right after this break. You are watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live on CGTN. Myanmar State Councilor Aung San Suu Kyi delivered a speech on Tuesday about the ongoing violence in the country. This is the very first time that the leader broke her almost a month-long silence on the Rohingya refugee crisis. Suu Kyi stressed that the clashes can only be addressed by eradicating the weaknesses of human nature, she said. Myanmar does not fear international scrutiny over the Rohingya unrest. The violence erupted in late August when Myanmar's army retaliated against the coordinated attacks by Rohingya militants. Since then, nearly 400,000 Rohingya Muslims have fled to Bangladesh to escape the fighting. They now languish in one of the world's largest refugee camps. Many global leaders have urged the resettling of those innocent civilians. UN Chief Antonio Guterres called on Myanmar to end the violence, which he said was best described as ethnic cleansing. Of course, those are the words coming from the United Nations. And to talk about what exactly is happening, has Aung San Suu Kyi's speech done anything to end the violence in her country? Let's loop in our panelists to find out. In Beijing studio, we have in here Song Ching-ren is Associate Professor at the Institute of South and South Asian and Oceanian Studies from the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. Welcome to our program, Mr. Song. Meanwhile, in Singapore, we have Lin Tan Wai, a research fellow adjunct of the East Asian Institute of the National University of Singapore. Mr. Lim, welcome as well. What exactly, I want to ask the two of you gentlemen, is the nature of this conflict? Is this about religion? Is this about politics? Is this about history that has never been settled? Mr. Lim, I want to go to you first before I go to Mr. Song here in Beijing. Mr. Lim.
This is a very complex conflict because there are so many elements involved and so many different perceptions. From the viewpoint of the government, they are dealing with some members of an insurgency. For example, groups like ARSA, which they accuse of a split as a splittist group in the Rakhine region. And at the same time, this whole thing is made more explosive because there's a religious element to it. The majority of Myanmaris are Buddhists, whereas the Rohingyas community are mostly Muslims. So some see a religious element or quality to this conflict. At the same time, there is also a social issue because there are human...
We have some problems at this point reaching to Mr. Lim, but let me come back to you, Mr. Song. Mr. Lim certainly lined out some of the perceptions that people are looking at this issue. Perceptions would always be there, no matter what. The question is, there is a crisis. How to handle it?
Yeah.
Ms. Suu Kyi has been very silent over the past almost 1 month, and now she finally spoke out. She seemed to enjoy a big support in her country on this.
Yeah. When I see some news about his speech, there are many people on the street or on the ground to watch the TV on the street or
Right.
near the city hall. So she got a lot of support from the domestic people, especially from the Buddhists, because the Buddhist occupies about more than 85% of the total population. So it's very important for the government, for the country's stability. About how to handle it, because just as the professor said, the issue is very complicated. Simply speaking, the Buddhists think that the Rohingyas are the foreigners. They don't want the government to give the Rohingyas the citizenship, nationality. And but the Rohingyas think that they live there for many scores of years or even hundreds of years. They should have the nationality. And the Buddhists think that the Rohingyas compete with them about the job opportunities, the resources, or so many other things. So the government is in a dilemma situation. If the government just satisfies the Rohingyas requirements, all of the requirements, or meets the pressure from the international society, the government will face another big demonstration from the Buddhists. The Buddhists occupy more than 85% of the country, so the government should think about the pressure from the Buddhist community.
It's very interesting to see this divide of opinions from inside Cambodia, from inside the country compared to from outside the country. Let's just say, particularly in Myanmar, the majority are supporting Ms. Suu Kyi and also how things being handled so far, which is mainly to leave to the parties to resolve by themselves. However, outside Myanmar, you see particularly in the so-called international press, the criticism toward Myanmar is extremely strong. You also heard from the United Nations, even the Secretary General have been using some very sensitive words toward the situation there. So how should we understand, Mr. Song, inside Myanmar, outside Myanmar, this huge divide of perceptions?
Yeah, this is the issue is not just the religious issue. It's about politics, also about the Myanmar's relations with the foreign countries or the EU, UN or other organizations.
Explain, please.
Yeah. So, so now I think the government, the Myanmar government should handle this issue, should resolve the humanitarian crisis in Rohingya Rakhine State and also about the border area. This is very important to resolve this. But I think second, the Rohingyas or international society should be patient about Myanmar's actions, because this is very complicated and the situation there is very dangerous. So the Myanmar government needs time to resolve this issue.
I see, but Mr. Lim, this is exactly what some international community has been talking about. I mean, this is already a boiling conflict over there in the country. Lives have been threatened, and certainly so-called fairness, equality, all of these issues have been challenged as a result of the ongoing conflict. So, according to others, issues have to be settled as soon as possible. And yet you also heard from Mr. Song, given all these complex issues, there has to be patience. How should we, in a way, weigh these two things all at the same time? Has the Suu Kyi government done things correctly with the right pace?
From the external gaze, from the international community, they are seeing a humanitarian crisis. Numbers of Rohingyas, 400,000 of them, 10 times. So there is an urgency. Some national community to about the crisis. The challenge here, in accordance with interpretation of other, especially those in Myanmar, is the.
I see. There are still some problems
areas.
that we are
right now,
linking to Mr. Lim. There are some broken voices. So I want to come back to you, Mr. Song, about the same question.
Yeah.
Expectations very different.
Yeah.
The way people see the complexity within the issue also very different.
Yeah.
Priorities are also different.
Yeah.
So what will be the right pace coming from you as an observer?
Yeah. First, I think the Myanmar government and the international society should cooperate. Yeah. Friendly, I mean friendly, not contradictory, to handle the human crisis in Rakhine State and the border area. This is a very important and urgent task. Second, I think the Myanmar government and the UN or other organizations or the Western countries should have some talks with the Myanmar government and also the Rohingyas, how to balance, different parties' requirements. Just as I said, the government just can't meet the requirements from the Rohingyas totally, but the Buddhist requirements should be cared. So how to balance the two camps or two groups' interest? This is very important.
Mr. Song, you also see that there has been a sea change of attitude. The so-called international community, particularly the Western countries, has and had toward Ms. Suu Kyi.
Yeah.
Before she came into power as a state councillor, and now. And she has become this very controversial figure, increasingly, in the descriptions of the press. Let's just say Western press, if we could use that general term. How much of this is changing others' picture about Myanmar, about her as a politician? And how much she has grown herself, grasped what she believed as the fundamentals of her political existence and the peace and stability of her country. Mr. Song.
As an opposition leader, when Aung San Suu Kyi before several years ago, she is very popular in the Western world, just as a popular political star. But now,
a freedom fighter.
Now, when she took power for more than 1 year, now I think any politician should be realistic, including Aung San Suu Kyi. So I think now she should consider first the Myanmar's most people's interest and requirements. This is very important for her government stability. Second, about the Myanmar's diplomatic principle and also the national interest. Because Myanmar is a country that, an independent country, it is not satisfied with foreign interference about his domestic politics. So this is also Myanmar's principle. So, but the Western countries always criticize Myanmar's domestic affairs. Third, about the fact. Now, the Myanmar government, Aung San Suu Kyi, and also the international society quarrel about the fact who fired as the common people or Russian guards, who fired their houses, what's the reasons, what's the causes, really led the Russian guards to leave the country. Right. So there are different opinions, there are different facts, there are quarrels. So this is the reasons, complicated.
While the debate is going on, Ms. Suu Kyi, as a freedom fighter to a politician in governance, Mr. Lim, certainly has been changing the perceptions in the others' eyes, at least in the Western press. What do you make of that change, and how much impact will that have on Ms. Suu Kyi's relationship with other partners, let's just say from the West, and how much will impact her country's future relations with these countries as well? Very briefly, Mr. Lim. I hope it works this time.
I think the state councillor has a lot of pressures right now, because the pressures come from not only state leaders in the West, but also from human rights groups and former Nobel Prize winners. So she has to handle a lot of pressure at the moment, and at the same time, she has to look at the equilibrium within her own domestic political audience. Therefore, I think she's trying to calibrate her skills as a politician and also as a person who is handling a humanitarian crisis. This is going to be difficult. It's not going to be easy, but the first challenge that has to be overcome, and she has also mentioned it herself, is to increase access to these areas that are in trouble right now and to be able to see the situation on the ground. And she has tried to invite the Western media as well as groups to go down to see. And right now, many groups are using satellite photos and also some much narrower access. So I think access would be the most important point right now for different stakeholders to look at what is truly happening as a crisis.
Transparency is always very important. We have seen, but things are getting ever complicated because more than 900,000 of Myanmar's 1.5 to 2 million Rohingyas have fled to neighboring countries, and it's going to have a big impact on the neighboring countries as well. Bangladesh now hosts most of Rohingya refugees. In the past 3 years, tens of thousands of Rohingyas sought refuge also in Thailand, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, these Southeast Asian countries. On the other hand, the US and Australia have also been approached but rejected settling Rohingya. Mr. Trump publicly U-turned on a pledge to accept refugees held in Australian camps. So the question is, Mr. Lim, well, others criticize Myanmar and criticize Ms. Suu Kyi. Have others done anything to help these people? Meanwhile, how will, given the complex situation, the others come to help and to support? After all, it is a refugee issue, as Mr. Guterres, the Secretary General, have also been talking about. Mr. Lim.
We have seen non-state actors come in to try to help. For example, religious leaders like the Pope has redirected a refugee ship from Libya to Myanmar. We have also seen Bangladesh trying to help in setting up the refugee camps, but of course this might be an opportunity for Myanmar and Bangladesh to work together because Bangladesh itself is facing a very terrible monsoon season, and therefore there's an opportunity for them to work together to try to resolve the crisis that's occurring right now. Right. So we are seeing a combination of state and non-state actors coming in to try to help resolve the crisis, and it remains very much in flux right now. As I said just now, perhaps access is probably the most important thing right now in order to help these groups back to normality.
I see. Mr. Song, final words from you. Some solutions as access. However, there's also a sovereign state that we are talking about, the country of Myanmar. So once again, a very delicate balance. Mr. Song, 30 seconds if you can.
Yeah, I think to resolve this issue, Myanmar government and the Rohingyas and the international society, and including the UN and the Western countries, and also the Bangladesh or other related stakeholders, should be patient to have talks, how to think about how to resolve this issue, step by step, not just the quarrel and criticism.
Not just criticism, but real actions to help and to solve the issue. Always the best advice, I guess. Song Ching-ren and Lin Tan-Wai. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN in your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Have a great night. See you tomorrow. Thank you.